I want to start out with a couple questions, and you can just enter in the chat box what you guys think. So what do you think is vulnerable to climate change? And what do you feel like is already being threatened or disrupted by climate change? Oops. So we've got water resources and environment. All life on Earth is vulnerable.
Brad also mentioned our sense of what is normal.
Yes. Yeah, I see that now. Yeah, water security. Subsistence farming, that's a good one. Agriculture. Anybody else? Forest, all right. Okay, well, it looks like people slow down, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. We have probably talked a lot about the climate science side of things and some of the impacts. We're going to move into vulnerability, which will start thinking about key items of concern. I think you guys briefly talked about that, had a discussion earlier. And so we'll start talking more about what affects those items, what are the impacts and consequences, and what are the related actions and choices we can take. So this is a climate adaptation cycle or planning cycle. There's many versions of this, but most of them have the same sort of steps. So there's water adaptation planning, climate adaptation, there's climate smart ag, there's all sorts of versions of this, but basically you start with your purpose and scope, and then you do a vulnerability assessment to assess what's vulnerable and how vulnerable it is, and we'll get into some of that. And then you may revise your goals based off of what is most vulnerable and how vulnerable things are. And that ideally drives your climate adaptation cycle of once you determine what's most vulnerable. And then you go through some different options to identify what you can do about that, so adaptation options. And then you go through processes to select or evaluate those options that you identified as possible options, to select which ones you're going to actually take. And then you work toward your implementation of those actions and funding those things and actually implementing. And then you track how well those things are being effective toward climate adaptation. And you may have to go back and adjust if they're not quite working as well as you had hoped, or maybe climate is happening a lot more intense than we originally thought or what you had planned for. So you may have to go back to some of your other adaptation options. And the idea here is that it's a cycle. So it's a continuing, ever evolving type of process. So it's not a one-time thing. So vulnerability, I think you guys talked a little bit about this with key items of concern. You can do comprehensive vulnerability assessments where you look at a lot of different things, or you can do vulnerability of certain aspects. So you could do just a cultural vulnerability assessments, or an ecosystems or species-based vulnerability assessment, or more of an infrastructure. And so we've been looking a lot at water adaptation for water suppliers and things like that. So infrastructure, or you could do species, and you could do you know, something more comprehensive of species across the region, or you could choose specific ones that you're interested in and things like that. So it really depends, again, on your scope and your goals of what your focus is. Or there are more comprehensive ones as well. So we just have to determine that before you ever got going down this road of vulnerabilities. So there's several definitions of vulnerability. Vulnerability's been around for a long time. And so this first one is an aggregate measure of human welfare that integrates environmental, social, economic, and political exposure to a range of harmful perturbations. So in reality, vulnerability, a lot of the terminology and the definitions came out of more of a social context and social sciences. Here's another definition. So the exposure of contingencies and stress and difficulty in coping with them. So that can apply to a lot of different things as things evolved in these fields. And then it wasn't until 2001 that the IPCC definition came out. And so it's the definition that we'll be talking more about today. And it's the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. So this is when it's the one we'll be talking about specifically to climate change. And so vulnerability assessments, you may be more familiar with risk assessments or things that came out of emergency management sort of realm of things. And a lot of vulnerabilities consider things, or assessments consider things that are not climate change related. So for example, on emergency management, you may see things like earthquakes. And so earthquakes aren't something that we've been talking about and that will be affected by climate change necessarily directly. And so again, we're framing it in the sense of climate change. So here's sort of where vulnerability assessments lie. So we've been talking a lot about these stressors and sort of the exposure aspect, which I'll talk more about. So the temperature, precipitation, extreme events. But vulnerability assessments start considering all these other types of things. So socioeconomic or ability to respond, and a lot of different other types of information that go into the vulnerability assessment. So that's a good little diagram. So I'm going to talk about three definitions that you need to be familiar with. And the first one is exposure. And exposure really is the degree of climate stress upon a particular unit of analysis. So looking at those long-term climate conditions or how variable things might be, the magnitude and frequency of the extreme events. So the exposure is really on the technical climate data side of things. Then the second definition that we need to be familiar with is sensitivity. And sensitivity is determining how big of an impact of the hazard. Giving some kind of degree or relative understanding of what we could expect for a particular area or a particular sort of sector or type of thing. So it depends very much on where you are. So I give an example here. So with precipitation variability, Oklahoma is exposed to drought, but obviously that degree of impact is different. So if we're talking about crop damages and how sensitive different crops are. So cotton versus corn versus something that's more drought tolerant, like maybe a sorghum or a different crop that does better under drought scenarios. Stresses on water resources. So again, that's going to vary depending on what you're talking about. So are we talking about aquifers and groundwater versus surface water, and different aspects of it? Dangerous to public health, so heat stress and heat strokes. And that's going to vary depending on what you're talking about. So are we talking about babies, or are we talking about elderly? Different aspects of who is sensitive to these heat strokes and heat illnesses. So a lot of other types of information to sort of get at what is sensitive and how sensitive it is. And the third definition we need to be familiar with is adaptive capacity, or resilience coping is often another way of framing it. And it's the ability to withstand negative impacts from the hazard and to adapt. So coping actions are things people do to protect from these types of impacts and sensitivities. So examples, you may look into mutual aid agreements or insurance, and different types of knowledge and understanding of, may create early warning systems and different ways to be ready to adapt. So another big aspect of vulnerability assessments are these sort of matrices. And so you create these sort of scales of how sensitive something is and how adaptive, and you score things based off of those and put them into categories. And so we'll look at a couple of, but these are both based off of 5 different levels. So you have 5 different boxes in both categories. This is just an example. Where this is the Navajo vulnerability assessment for, and I pulled 2 species here. So the golden eagle is considered more vulnerable because it's got 3 of the categories that were scored in the red category. So they were more vulnerable than the mountain lion. But as you can see, they have many different categories here that they're scoring out for vulnerability. So they have several different things that they're looking at. So something might be more vulnerable in certain categories or reasons why it's vulnerable than other areas. And so the total, so you would somehow summarize how you scored this out of an overall sort of vulnerability scoring based off of that. So this is just an example of how they chose to do their vulnerability assessments. But again, this would be for the Navajo reservation. So these species may be less vulnerable or different in a different region. So you have to look at it for your area and things like that. So you can't just take theirs and borrow it and use it for yourself, most likely. Another big aspect of vulnerability assessments is planning. So with oysters, we've gotten really good at growing oysters and knowing where we can grow them and how to grow them under different conditions. And we farm them, we grow them and for an economic reason. Where a lot of things, we have not mastered that sort of planning or restoration component, right? Like we don't know how well or how to assist things in adapting to differences or changing. And if we needed to grow them somewhere else, we haven't done that yet, or we haven't sort of figured out that piece. So there may be more research into something that isn't as common, that we don't plan for or do, but planning for an oyster makes it less vulnerable. So that's why it's yellow for all these of the Gulf Coast here. It's not considered a highly vulnerable species in this case. And so you got to think about your planning, your adaptive capacity to assist her to what we know about the species and things like that too. So this is, so that last one that I was sharing, the oysters, this is from the Gulf Coast Vulnerability Assessment that was done in 2015. And it was a species assessment primarily, but they did look at some ecosystems. And so the species itself may be considered not vulnerable like this blue crab, but the marsh is considered vulnerable. And so in this case, the tidal marsh is scored as a high, and the mangroves down in southern Florida is considered very high vulnerability. And so in result, depending on how you look at it, of what your approach to adaptation would be, if are you trying to save specifically the blue crab species and how that versus ecosystem. So there's been a lot of talk about looking at this Gulf Coast Vulnerability Assessment and extending it to include other aspects of the Gulf Coast. And so things like human vulnerability, or maybe infrastructure vulnerability, and other types of planning. I just had a call this morning about cultural heritage for the Gulf Coast as well, and I'll talk about that, some of that a little bit later. But so there, these vulnerability assessments of how to be more comprehensive in other aspects of the Gulf that, or other areas. But this is one of the great examples of a vulnerability assessment that's been done in our region. So I wanted to, again, sort of reiterate that there's a lot of other information and knowledge that you would have to gather to go into a vulnerability assessment to be able to do one. So this is just an example of something you might consider. So types of questions you might ask. So who has the data for farmers in your jurisdiction, and what types of crops do they grow? Are farmers able to adapt to more intense and recurring droughts? Why are they not able to adapt? Is it an economic or other issues? How bad is the economic impact of drought when they occur, or it has been the economic impacts in the past? What would be needed to adapt over time? So is it where they need irrigation equipment, or they would need new equipment and knowledge to grow a different type of crop in order to be successful at that? And does your organization assist farmers to respond? And are there opportunities or things that your organization might be able to assist with? So really thinking about sort of all the types of information and understanding their situation in order to determine and get at why they would be vulnerable, or what would be needed. So again, the climate adaptation cycle. So a lot of people ask, where do we start? What is that sort of first step? Just give me a second here. And so vulnerability assessment is, if you were to follow the adaptation cycle, is typically where you would start within a climate adaptation plan. And so that's what's typically recommended, but you can hop into this process at different stages depending on what you're working on, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. So I wanted to provide you guys some resources and frameworks for your different sectors to help sort of direct you in a good direction. So if you're specifically interested in a species guidebook, and And so the National Conservation Training Center, which is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they use this document, the Scanning for Conservation Horizon. And so this is a great resource for species vulnerability assessments. And I provide the link here. And I believe, Emma, you're going to share the slides too with everybody. So you'll be able to come back to these and get those. But so that's a great resource for that. And then I wanted to specifically talk about a couple tools where they've done a lot of this work already for you. And so there's NatureServe. They have what they call a climate change vulnerability index. And so they've looked at and scored out how vulnerable many species and plants already for the US. And they're starting to do this for a lot of other international countries as well. But they score it out for 5 different categories. So, and so again, it depends on sort of how many categories you want to look at. One of the cons though with this specific tool is it uses the Climate Wizard data, and it's not necessarily recommended because we don't, it doesn't use the best available climate data available. And if you are interested more in that, you can contact us and we'd be happy to talk with you more about that. But they have all the tool that you can download and all their training available on their website. And you can go in and see if you agree with and pull up different species. And so I know some of the audiences I work with are using this as sort of a starting point, and then sort of having discussions of whether they agree with these, the NatureServe for their region.
Hey, April?
Yeah.
Could you maybe say, I don't want to put you on the spot if you can't say it's okay, but in terms of the Climate Wizard, like if we're looking at this data, is it just that it sort of trends too conservative or it trends not conservative enough? Or like, is there anything general you can tell us to sort of?
So I'm going to defer to Adrienne since she's on.
Yeah, so I've worked with Climate Wizard extensively in the past. And the problem with it is that it uses a downscaling technique, which actually can make the data particularly under variable, which is to say there's not enough floods and there's not enough droughts that show up in it.
Okay. So it's a little too rosy paints a little too rosy of a picture.
It can be a little too rosy, yeah. It doesn't maintain the variability that we would expect there to be naturally in the climate to begin with. It doesn't really change it all that much either.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, but a lot of people are now using NatureServe as sort of a starting point, because it is something and it's something available and something to get started to at least considering climate change. So the second one that I want to mention is a different approach, and it's called SAVS, or System for Assessing Vulnerability of Species. And they use 22 different criteria, so they're a lot more comprehensive. And this is more of a questionnaire approach. And so you would have to do the literature research, review, and look at all your published materials and the most relevant and most available. You would have to get expert consultation of actual ecologists that study the particular species or region that you're interested in. And you would get a much broader set of scores. So it goes from -20 to +20, and +20 being your most vulnerable. And then you would get an overall score as well. And so you get a much broader range of scores and categories, and you would have to determine how to what to do with that and how to interpret that and what that means for you and your area. And so here's the link for that tool, and they have all their questionnaires and things available for you there. And so this is a different approach. And one of the pros of this is that you can use our Climate Science Center best available climate science data available for something like this. One that I really like is what we call Climate Smart. And so Climate Smart is a way to integrate climate smart goals or aspects into any kind of plan that you're working on, whether that's an emergency management plan or an agriculture, or maybe it's a forestry plan, all sorts of plans. And you would just be able to integrate these sort of concepts and goals and climate smart into whatever you're doing. So one piece that I've been teaching a lot lately is monitoring. So climate smart monitoring. How do you consider climate change in your monitoring plans? And so that's a chapter, a piece of this climate smart framework. And so I recommend that one. Here's another great resource is from our colleagues at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, and they have these what we call menus, and they are creating more or less your list of climate adaptation options for different cases. So one that I really like is the forested watershed menu. So it basically helps you figure out what are your potential options that you could use to adapt to climate change for a watershed. Another one they have is this newer one that's for agriculture. But I put the list of all theirs here. So there's quite a few now. And so one I've been teaching a lot about is the tribal one. So there may be something here that that would be useful to you depending on where you're at and what you work, what type of area you work on. So they've been kicking out quite a few of these adaptation menus and resources specifically for different areas. So I really like their approach. And again, they base a lot of their work off of that climate smart adaptation framework and started creating all these tools and resources. The only time they've been in our region that I know of is they were at, they did a workshop for urban forestry in Austin a year or so ago. But anyways. So for the water people, we have the EPA CREATE, which is the risk assessment application for water utilities. And again, they've sort of created a whole list of potential water adaptation options. A few years ago, they created the vulnerability self-assessment tool, which was based off of the new Water Infrastructure Act. And so that's on there as well. And they've actually been doing workshops as well across the US. And so they emailed me not too long ago and said they want to talk more in August or so later about maybe doing a workshop in our region. But these are great resources for that. Another great resource from EPA is their drought response and recovery. And so they don't call it climate adaptation, but they have some great options for drought adaptation and starting to get people to think about longer term and adapting. But it's a great resource and guidebook as well. For our National Park Service people, I wanted to share a few resources. So the National Park Service years ago released their climate change strategy. And so I provided the link here for that. And we've been working with a group out of the Intermountain region. And so there's a working group that we've been working with and having discussions. And National Park Service, their climate change and cultural resource staff had resigned a few years ago. and they're actually in the process of hiring 2 new ones. And so hopefully we'll get to meet them, and they're supposed to take over this working group once they're hired. But one of the things that's coming out of that group is they're developing the guidebook for climate change and cultural heritage. So they're developing a book on how to assess vulnerability of cultural resources. And it's supposed to be coming out this year. So we've been having they've been doing some workshops and things to sort of pilot it as well. And they also released a report of climate change vulnerability assessments for some of the National Park Service cultural resources. And so that's supposed to come out this year as well, where they've done vulnerability assessments and examples of those for sites. So those are just, so I wanted to share examples of some of those impacts. And so this is a site where they have a church that was impacted by a heavy rainfall event, and some of the results. And then some adaptation options being considered for cultural resources. So you probably heard about this Cape Hatteras and the relocating their lighthouse. So obviously that's a more intense, a number 5 on the list of scale of doing nothing, and some of the different things you could, or different levels of actions you could do. So that's what I had for you all today, and hopefully that gets you to thinking about whether you would be interested in doing vulnerability assessments or climate adaptation plans, or maybe if we were to continue some of our training efforts, we've done some vulnerability assessment trainings or climate adaptation sort of workshops, or bringing in somebody. We would definitely be interested if there are people who are interested in continuing that discussion. So that's all I had for you. Anybody have questions for me?